Okay, so get ready because today we're doing a deep dive on someone I think you guys are going to find really interesting. We're looking at Decca Heggie.
Yeah, this should be a good one.
Yeah, you've sent us a bunch of YouTube clips, and it's like raw footage of this guy's life.
Raw is a good way to put it.
He's a former bare-knuckle boxer, and now he runs a security firm and a fighting company.
Yeah, a real Renaissance man.
This guy, Decca Heggie, he seems like quite the character, like one of these guys where we're really going to have our hands full with this deep dive.
Yeah, for sure.
We're piecing together a picture of him based on these little snippets, these glimpses into his life. It's really interesting how much of what we see feels like a performance.
Yeah, it's almost as if he's constructing a persona for the camera. Like, who is Decca Heggie trying to convince us or himself?
That's such a good point.
You know?
Yeah, and he really doesn't hold back on the self-promotion either. He's constantly going on about being this undefeated fighter.
Right.
About having connections to Tyson Fury's camp.
Of course, gotta have that.
About running with a firm.
Yeah.
It's almost comical how over the top it is.
Like a caricature almost.
He even compared himself to Charles Bronson at one point.
Right. Well, that name dropping is interesting. It speaks to this desire to align himself with a certain image. The tough guy, the one you don't mess with.
Yeah.
He seems to be crafting this image of power and invincibility.
But then he tries to soften the edges a bit. You know, he talks about being a changed man, respectful of women because he loves his Nana.
Right.
So it's like he's trying to balance this tough guy persona with this image of someone who's sensitive deep down, you know?
Yeah. And that's where we start to see the potential signs of what psychologists call narcissistic personality disorder. This often involves having a grandiose sense of self-importance, a deep need for admiration, and a lack of empathy. And while we can't diagnose anyone from afar, these boasts and contradictions do seem to fit that pattern.
It really makes you wonder what's driving this need to control the narrative, to shape how people see him.
Yeah, what's he compensating for? Makes you wonder.
And speaking of contradictions, things take a turn when he interacts with Stephanie, this undercover journalist who reached out to him. What starts as somewhat charming quickly reveals some concerning behaviors.
Like what?
Well, he starts complimenting her, telling her she's different from other women, but it doesn't take long for those compliments to morph into something. Well, less flattering.
Less flattering how?
Well, he actually says to her at one point, "You're mine now," and starts dictating how she should behave, who she can and can't talk to.
And that's a classic example of coercive control. It's a pattern of behaviors used to dominate and control a partner. And it's not just about jealousy either. It's about power and isolation. You see, he's trying to cut her off from her support system, making her more dependent on him.
Yeah, it's really unsettling to hear. Like, he even tells her to delete social media, says he doesn't trust her contacts. It's like he's trying to trap her in his world.
Exactly. And that isolation is often a precursor to more serious forms of abuse. By controlling her access to information and support, he gains a dangerous level of power and influence over her.
It's chilling to think about. And what's striking is how quickly he jumps from these attempts at charm to outright rage. Like, one minute he's complimenting her, and the next he's furious over the mere suggestion that she might find someone else attractive, even hypothetically.
Yeah, that level of possessiveness is really concerning. It speaks to a deep-seated insecurity and a need to control her every thought and feeling.
Yeah.
He's projecting his own fears and insecurities onto her, making her responsible for managing his emotions.
It's a lot to unpack, and just when you think you have him figured out, he flips the script and starts talking about his own vulnerabilities.
Yeah, this is where things get even more complex.
Yeah.
He reveals some very personal and painful experiences, talking about past sexual abuse, suicide attempts, struggles with mental health.
It's heavy stuff, and you can't help but feel a sense of empathy for anyone who's gone through such trauma. But then the question arises, is he using these past experiences as a way to deflect responsibility for his current actions?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, it's crucial to acknowledge that trauma can have a profound impact on someone's behavior. However, it's never an excuse for abuse.
And the timing of these confessions is interesting, isn't it? It often seems to happen right after he's been particularly controlling or aggressive towards Stephanie.
Exactly. It's like clockwork. He explodes, he pushes back, and suddenly he's the victim, seeking comfort and understanding. It's a classic manipulation tactic designed to shift the focus away from his harmful behavior and back onto himself.
It's like he's almost weaponizing his past trauma to avoid being held accountable for what he's doing in the present. Right.
And it makes it that much harder to figure out what's genuine and what's manipulation.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that human behavior is rarely black and white.
Right.
People can be both victims of trauma and perpetrators of abuse.
For sure.
And I think it's not about excusing his actions, but understanding the complex factors that might be driving them.
Yeah, absolutely. And just when we start to delve into this whole other layer of his personality, he pivots again.
What's he on to now?
It's back to the firm and his business dealings.
Ah, yeah.
Remember all that?
Of course.
Yeah, so he's going on and on about his security business, right?
Yeah.
But then there are all these little comments about violence weapons expanding his influence,
I see.
and it starts to feel a lot more ominous than it did before.
Yeah, this is where those underlying threads of control and power all seem to converge. He boasts about his security business, but then there are these mentions of violence, weapons, expanding his influence. It starts to feel more ominous, like how much of this is performance for the camera.
It's like he's trying to intimidate people almost.
Yeah, is he trying to intimidate potential rivals? Or is this a glimpse into a darker reality, a world where he really does wield that kind of power?
Yeah, and it really makes you think back to those original questions we had.
Like what?
Like, who is Decca Heggie?
Right.
What is the purpose of all these videos?
Yeah.
And what about Stephanie? I mean, this is an undercover journalist who's going undercover to get this footage of him.
Right.
And she's putting herself in a potentially risky situation.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Her presence adds a whole other layer of complexity to this story. Is she a willing participant in this, aware of the image he's trying to project? Or is she in over her head walking a tightrope to expose something darker?
It's hard to imagine anyone willingly subjecting themselves to that kind of treatment.
I know.
But then again, journalists often go to great lengths to get the story.
Oh, they absolutely do. And that raises questions about the ethics of it all. Is it responsible to engage with someone like this knowing his tendencies potentially putting yourself at risk? Or is it important to expose those tendencies to show the world what's hiding behind the bravado?
It's a tough call.
It really is.
And there are no easy answers.
Not at all.
But you know what I think is so interesting about this whole deep dive is that it forces us to confront these questions head on. We live in a world that is just saturated with curated content.
Oh.
Like everyone has this perfect, polished version of themselves online.
Oh, yeah.
And then you have Decca Heggie.
Yeah.
This raw, unfiltered glimpse into one man's complexities, contradictions, and disturbing behaviors.
And you know what's left for you, the listener, is this: don't take everything at face value.
It's so true.
Question the narratives you encounter both online and in your own life. Look for those subtle signs of manipulation and control. And never underestimate the power of insecurity and the lengths people will go to mask it.
Well said. Decca Heggie might just be some name that you stumbled upon online. But this deep dive into his world, I think it reminds us that things are rarely black and white. Be critical, be curious, and keep asking questions. Until next time.